Welcome back to the DYK podcast discussion series. We're pleased to have with us today Sheila Krumholz, who is the executive director of OpenSecrets.org. Open Secrets is a nonpartisan, independent nonprofit in Washington, D.C. that analyzes the lobbying industry. Open Secrets is the nation's premier research group tracking money in U.S. politics and its effect on elections and public policy. Open Secrets' mission is to track the flow of money in American politics and provide the data and analysis to strengthen democracy. As the executive director, Sheila acts as the liaison to Open Secrets' board and major funders and is the organization's primary spokesperson. Sheila became executive director in 2006 after spending 8 years as Open Secrets research director, supervising data analysis for OpenSecrets.org and Open Secrets clients. In 2022, Sheila was named one of the 500 most influential people in Washington, D.C. She has a degree in international relations and political science from the University of Minnesota. In our interview, which was conducted on February 8, 2023, Sheila gives us a lesson in Lobbying 101 and also, importantly, discusses the nature and scope of the NCAA's and Power 5's lobbying campaign in Congress. Welcome, Sheila, to the DYK podcast. We're so happy to have you here today.
Delighted to be with you. Thank you.
Well, let's dive right in. If you could tell us what Open Secrets is, your role at Open Secrets, its history, and its mission.
Yes. So I am executive director of Open Secrets. I nearly said Center for Responsive Politics. That was our organization's name for nearly 40 years. However, last year we merged with another organization, the National Institute on Money and Politics, and so we are now known as Open Secrets. We are a nonpartisan nonprofit research organization tracking money in politics, and we have the mission of providing this data to the public. Ultimately, we are a public interest organization, but we work with the press primarily to help us disseminate this information as widely as possible. And we also provide our information to scholars who will do, work we are not trained to do, and perhaps those studies will inform reform efforts. And we also make it available, of course, to anyone, to advocacy organizations who will use it in their change-making efforts. But it is also, of course, available to individual members of the public, to corporations. They love our free data for their
So
use.
do I, by the way. I've made good use of it. It's a wonderful resource.
Excellent. So, our vision is that people will use this data to inform their own political engagement. We want people to be informed, active members of the voting public, and in this way, we're helping them to kind of even the playing field. Because, of course, as I said, corporations use our data. Corporations pay a lot of money to corporations, many organizations spend a lot of money trying to influence what happens in Washington and in state capitals around the country. And so by providing information on who's doing what, we hope to put information into the hands of the public so that they can also take a seat at the table.
Yeah, I've been intrigued by the name Open Secrets. Is there a backstory there?
There is, indeed. We were founded by two former senators, Frank Church, a Democrat of Idaho, and Hugh Scott, a Republican of Pennsylvania. Back in 1983, they were nearing retirement and wanted to do something to help to spur more engagement and trust by the public in their government, in their democracy. But a few years later, the organization hired Larry Makinson, and he was a reporter in Alaska who had taken on a project to code every contribution by industry and classify it by organization and kind of fingerprint where the money was coming from. And his book was he produced a book about money in Alaska called Open Secrets, and the notion being that money's influence is an open secret in Washington or around the country. And I think the Speaker of the California State Assembly, Jesse Unruh, famously said, money is the mother's milk of politics. And it's kind of funny, kind of cynical, but our goal is to ensure that people do not become cynical and apathetic and disengaged, but rather they have the tools at their disposal to get engaged and make the change that they want to see that is in their interest.
Yeah, that's a great backstory. I love that. And I love the name, Open Secrets. So one of our main themes with DYK is transparency, and we're trying to get our message to athletes. And I think a lot of athletes, and I would say even stakeholders at the institutional level, don't know really what goes on in Washington with lobbying, and probably don't know that the NCAA and the Power Five have very aggressive, robust lobbying presence in D.C. So if you could just explain kind of lobbying 101 for our athletes and our other stakeholders. What are lobbyists? What do they do? What are their loyalties? How's the game played?
Yeah. Well, of course, the right to seek redress of grievances is a constitutionally protected right, as is often raised by lobbyists. But their job is to sell influence. They have set up shop in Washington and again in state capitals across the country to sell their services to those who can afford them, to provide a shortcut to clients, organizations that are looking to influence policy, to often, at least in the case of for-profit corporations, to help them have a healthier bottom line. And so there are competing interests that legislators need to consider. And lobbyists, the job of a lobbyist is to provide them with information that is helpful to the legislator, but also helpful to their client to show the perspective of their client, their company, their industry, their organization, and help them make a decision that is palatable to the politician and favorable to their client. So they're selling influence. If
Right.
the pejorative term is influence peddlers, but it is something that, is more information, I think, is a good thing. We can all agree. We don't want to censor information. The imbalance here is that there is more information and more favorable information provided by those who can afford it.
Right. So there's a power game here. And I think a lot of Americans may not understand the extent of that in Washington, D.C. But I want to be clear that when you hire a lobbyist, the lobbyist's duty is to the client, not to the greater good, not to the legislators. It is to the client and to do what the client wants. And with corporate interests, that's usually protecting economic interests, right?
Absolutely. Lawyers and lobbyists, of course, in many industries, their duty is to their client and their client's interests. And these clients wouldn't spend, at least at the federal level, what turns out to be billions of dollars annually if it wasn't a good investment. So it's both good for the client and the lobbyists want to make sure that their clients are happy with their services.
How many lobbyists are there in Washington, D.C., roughly?
Yeah, there are roughly 11,000, now 12,000,
Wow.
more than 12,000 lobbyists in this last year. That when we first started tracking lobbying, there were only 10,400 back in 1998. Now that's an at-least figure because some
Right.
folks who are effectively lobbyists act as lobbyists but are known as strategic advisors. They do not register. And so there's been a high watermark in 2007 of about 15,000 lobbyists, and then that dropped off pretty precipitously. Interestingly, the money has only gone up over time. So while there are fewer lobbyists than there used to be, there is much more money spent on lobbying, begging the question whether there are, in fact, many, many more lobbyists than are registered.
That's still a big number. I mean, that landed with me with a wow, 12,000 lobbyists. And I want to talk about the registration process, the disclosure process. But before I get to that, I want to talk a little bit about something you alluded to earlier when you were talking about the history of Open Secrets. And that's this climate and culture in DC, where lobbying and the lobbying presence is just taken for granted. It's just part of the scenery. And I think for a lot of Americans who haven't spent a lot of time in D.C., they don't understand that. How important is the climate and culture of D.C. in the flexibility that lobbyists have and kind of the room to maneuver that might not exist in an environment where there's a little more scrutiny?
Well, lobbyists have a lot of latitude because they are, first of all, often hailing from Congress. They may have come from staff, from members of Congress. They may be former members of Congress. Right. They are often staff experts from the congressional committees. So they're bringing a lot of knowledge, often a lot of expertise about particular issues that they might have worked on while in Congress or in government and other agencies. And they bring a lot of connections. So,
right.
Some say it's not what you know, it's who you know. Well, in this case, it's both. Lobbying firms are seeking people who can appear as experts on an issue so that their pitch on behalf of a client is viewed as trustworthy by legislators, decision makers, but it also helps to get their calls returned and their meetings taken if they know whom they're meeting with because they used to work there. Right. They used to work with them, they know them, and even perhaps they play golf or tennis on the weekends together. So these very lucrative relationships are cemented by the lucrative lobbying relationships, pay for these existing relationships with powerful people in Washington, and they pay for the expertise these people have accumulated. And people who are leaving Congress can earn, easily triple, quadruple, many times what they made while working in Congress on K Street, what's known as the synonym for lobbying. At least in Washington, but I think the same is probably true in state capitals across the country.
Yeah, you have a link on your website that describes the revolving door. I think that's really what you're talking about here. If you could just elaborate on that a little bit, because that's one element that I think a lot of Americans don't understand. And that, when we talk about this kind of symbiotic relationship between the lobbying community, government service, or work in the corporate world, I think that's where people say, wait a minute, that's influence peddling. That's not advocacy.
Yes. Well, lobbying is, I think, one of those yes and or two sides of the coin. On the one hand, if you are a person seeking help from your representatives, whatever the issue may be, whether it's an industry issue or a personal issue, you want to know whom you should be speaking with. You want to, be connected to the right people. The revolving door is, but on the other hand, again, we don't want people to think that they won't have access unless they know the right people. Unfortunately, there are only so many hours in the day. There's only so much time for members of Congress to share with constituents, with people seeking their time and influence. And so they have to pick and choose whom they're going to meet with, whose calls they're going to take. Several hours of every day need to be spent raising funds for their next reelection. The point is, revolving door means people are coming from government, from Congress, going to lobbying firms, and those people have the connections, the access, and they're able to convert that into a high salary for themselves. They can sell those relationships. And to be honest, lobbyists are people. That's in their nature. The best lobbyists are those who kind of collect relationships and maintain cordial relationships with members of Congress, with their staff over many years. That's kind of the coin of the realm.
So if you could speak to how lobbyists are regulated and the disclosure requirements, the registration requirements, and then we're going to talk about a couple of specific disclosure documents that I'm going to talk about in a minute. But if you could just talk about that, the registration regulation, how much information is really accessible to the public is the bottom line there.
Well, these reports on how much a lobbyist is earning and whom they're representing are reported to the Secretary of the Senate and the Clerk of the House quarterly. Now, it used to be semi-annual, now it's quarterly. And they must report, again, whom they're working for, what they are working on, which bills they are working on, and how much they've earned from those clients. They also list kind of general issue areas that they're working on, taxes, regulation, and then in the bill information, you see a little bit more about the details, which specific pieces of legislation they're lobbying on. They don't have to tell us their point of view, what side of an issue they're lobbying, whether it's for or against that bill, but one can often tease that out from kind of who they are and their public statements on issues. But it is quite a jigsaw puzzle to put all of this information together. So the rules are that they have to disclose an organization employing in-house lobbyists, people on their payroll. They have to report if they're if their expenses for lobbying activities are more than $14,000 during a quarterly period. And the lobbying firms, those firms existing to represent clients, have a $3,000 income threshold. They also must register. The registration requirement is triggered where they have to report to the House and Senate that they've taken on a new client if on the date their employer or lobbyist is employed or retained, they plan to make more than one lobbying contact, so 2 or more contacts on behalf of a client, and they will spend 20% of their time working for that client. So it's quite a pretty low bar at the federal level when we're talking about billions of dollars. On the other hand, it's quite flexible. For instance, it's basically an honor system. There might be compliance offices for big firms, but what if I work an 80-hour week? Then what's 20% of my time? So it can be fudged, and there isn't a lot of enforcement.
To your jigsaw puzzle observation, I've looked at a good number of lobbying reports for the lobbyists that work for the NCAA and the Power 5. And it's interesting because when they describe the nature of their work, some of those descriptions are very brief and very cryptic. So there's a lot of play in the joints there. And then for the lobbyists that actually list bills that are relevant to their lobbying, they don't say specifically whether they are supporting or opposing those bills. And you have to really understand the legislation. You really have to know your stuff and do your legwork to make sense of these lobbying reports. Is that fair?
Absolutely. And you can get very terse, cryptic information and description, or you can be buried in information with so much jargon and information that it also obscures kind of the true emphasis. The other thing is that if a client says, well, we spent $1 million on lobbying, and then lists lots of different areas of focus, you don't know if the vast majority of that financial activity was directed at one specific thing. So they can list a number of different topics, but we have no way of knowing if one is what really mattered to them.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about the big lobbying firms. And there's, big lobbying. I mean, you have 12,000 lobbyists, but you have some heavy hitters in the market. And you publish, Open Secrets publishes a top 20 lobbying firm list every year. Could you talk a little bit about that and how that segment of the lobbying market works?
Indeed, yes. So we do collect all of this data on all kinds of money in politics, including lobbying, and we, again, categorize it by a variety of ways. We standardize it by organization, by entity, in this case, by lobbying firm, so that we can say, here are the big guns, here are the top spenders or the top income earners on lobbying, on reported lobbying. And for 2022, the top lobbying firm by income is Brownstein Hyatt, a perennial top performer, a top earner at more than $60 million just in the last year. And that's just on what, reported lobbying. Their income, their revenue is maybe far higher than that. That's just what we can see. Akin Gump is another kind of blue chip lobbying name, which comes in second at 53 million. Holland and Knight at 43 million. BGR Group is fourth, and that's interesting. B in BGR is Barber. Haley Barber was former RNC chairman. Some of these firms are founded as kind of a Democrat, founded by Democrats or founded by Republicans, and are known as being tilting to one party or the other. But typically, firms want to have access to both parties, people in both parties.
So what kind of clients have access to the Brownstein Hyatts and the Aiken Gumps of the lobbying world?
Oh, these
as
are
a practical matter. Yeah.
These are the biggest names in corporate America. These are very, multinational corporations, associations representing those corporations, and organizations very often that kind of are used to playing in politics. So again, it might be huge, big pharmaceutical companies, big banks, big, agribusiness companies, all kinds, financial firms, all kinds of clients, including beyond corporate clients, of course, associations representing corporations, but then also ideological organizations as well.
So this is a very sophisticated level of lobbying. I mean, we're talking about probably the most sophisticated lobbying and, influence peddling, if you view it that way, in the world.
Yes, at this level, at the height of the lobbying heap, these are firms that are seen as among the most powerful in Washington. We think of Washington as being about politics, but it's, I would say, as much about the money to be made off of politics by lobbyists, by political consultants. It's kind of the political industrial complex at work here. And so
what are you getting if you're a company and you hire a Brownstein Hyatt or an Aiken Gump? What are you getting with that? And then what are the common objectives? You mentioned some of the bigs, and I would add big tobacco, big oil, big gambling, big gaming, all those companies. And Brownstein Hyatt represents a lot of companies in one of those industries. And what are the common tactics of the big lobbying firms than the bigs representing the bigs?
Well, one difference is that they're more likely to have access because they have, they're representing not just any client, but major employers, very often employers in the home states and districts of the members of Congress they are trying to meet with. So they're representing, major business, and that is something that is easy for legislators to justify that they need to get the perspective of these corporate titans because this is their job is to ensure a healthy economy and fairness in issues of matters of policy.
And so it seems to me like there may be two purposes. If the client is for example, opposing a piece of legislation that they think is detrimental to their economic interests, the lobbyists can be effective in trying to prevent that legislation from going forward. And then you also have big corporations seeking protective or advantageous legislation to protect their economic interests. And how important is it for either of those purposes, but particularly the second one, because that's relevant to what the NCAA is doing right now in Congress? How important is it to control the message, control the language, and then have those issues move through Congress in the hearing process in a way that is favorable to the client's interest?
Well, it's life or death to the client. Very often they need their lobbyists to be successful in making their perspective not only known and understood, but convincingly, so that members of Congress, their staff who will be advising them, the committee staff, all understand how wonderful it will be if the legislation they favor is passed and how catastrophic it will be if the legislation they oppose succeeds. So their job is most often to kill legislation. I mean, that's much easier to put in, the poison pills than to get something accomplished in Congress, especially given division and gridlock. Yeah, their job is to make it as easy as possible for those in positions of power, members of Congress, et cetera, leaders in government agencies, it's not just Congress, to see it their way and to have at their disposal the specific language that they would use to either promote or oppose legislation. So they're literally very often just giving them the script.
The script, right. And coordinating the message is so important. And a lot of these big titans of industry have their own corporate public relations staffs, but there are also some big time public relations companies in DC, and the NCAA hired, for example, Bully Pulpit Interactive Inc. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but they have been very involved in kind of coordinating the message. And how important is it that you have a comprehensive coordination of the messaging if you're going in to ask for a piece of protective federal legislation?
The coordination is hugely helpful because you want them to have a sense that this is, these views of my company, my client are in fact not just about me. These are widely held views. Everybody knows that this is the way you should vote. It's clear. You're hearing it from all perspectives, and they are hearing, if they're taking meetings with one client, they'll get that message. But if they're also taking meetings with the association, Lobbyists, and other related entities, and hearing the same thing. And then they're getting that messaging maybe through others in the party who are taking on that view on behalf of the industry. Again, it's almost viewed as irresponsible of legislators to not be promoting the interests of their state, of their district. And so if, for instance, these conferences are big business back home, the legislators know that they're going to be hearing from the school alums, athletic boosters, if they don't do the right thing. And furthermore, it means money, to these academic institutions. So it's easy for them to say, hey, I'm just representing my state.
Yeah. And so I just want to let the cat out of the bag. The NCAA has had Brownstein Hyatt as its lobbyist since 2014. They went big. They went bold. In fact, there was a newsletter that came from Open Secrets back when they made that move, when they hired Brownstein Hyatt, and it said the NCAA is going pro. They had that tagline, going pro and something other than sports. But that's big time lobbying, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
Right. And I think a lot of people would be surprised to learn that. And one of the things that's not widely understood is how big the NCAA and the Power Five conferences are going in their engagement with Congress to get what they want. And they want 3 federal protections and immunities that would essentially make them untouchable. And they couldn't be sued under antitrust laws. States wouldn't be able to pass laws that conflict with the NCAA's compensation limits. Athletes couldn't be employees. Those 3 things, huge asks. You're invoking preemption, antitrust immunity, and eliminating the labor rights of athletes. Those are massive asks, and the NCAA has been moving forward on this since 2019. And then the first hearing was conducted in February of 2020. And there have been 7 hearings so far, and I've paid very close attention to the hearings. There's a scripted component to it. Before I really dove into the lobbying activity and the extent of it and the crossover, I just had this sense that I was watching kabuki theater, that it was these hearings were staged. Is that something that you get when you hire a Brownstein Hyatt?
Yes, because they're experts at persuasion, and seeing that repetition, seeing the same message being touted again and again and again by different witnesses at hearings and in the marketing materials and in the expertise that lobbyists both provide and leave behind with staff and members in Congress. That's all part of the package that they offer at no small cost. And so they're able to say, look, you're going to have to pay more. NCAA, you're going to have to pay more. And the others that are lobbying on this, you're going to have to pay more to get our level of expertise, but we are the best. Right. And we have a success rate to
So
to
the NCAA has Brownstein Hyatt. The SEC, Southeastern Conference, which is one of the 2 big time conferences. You have 5 Power 5 conferences, but the Big Ten and the SEC are kind of at the top of the heap. The SEC has Aiken Gump on the payroll for them, pretty heavy hitting. And then the other firms, I think 4 of the firms that are on your top 20 list are represented among the 8 that represent the NCAA or the Power 5. And there's coordination among the Power 5 interests and what they're promoting and what the NCAA is doing. This is a very high level, sophisticated campaign. But when you hear those names, does that suggest to you that this is big time?
Yes, they're willing to pay the price to get the best. And all of those lobbyists, they're working together at the Power 5 to ensure a consistent message, consistent language is used by the firms that represent them.
Mm-hmm.
And that, again, makes it easier for those making decisions in Congress to understand their position, to remember their language, and to be able to parrot that with their colleagues as they seek co-sponsors or to amass support. So this is pretty standard. I think what's interesting is just the jump in spending by the NCAA, more than tripled lobbying spending since 2013. And as you know, 2014 was a critical year. And they're basically only lobbying on, as according to the records, athletes' rights, name issue, likeness, NIL issues. So that to me says this is I hate to say this, but a full court press. This is right. There are other analogies I should be using. This is okay. This is serious. We need to all get on the same page. We need to spout the same rhetoric. We need to invest. Our lifeblood of this institution is on the line, and that is what we see not all the time, but periodically when an industry or a particular company is really under threat, typically of taxation or increased regulation. Mm-hmm. You will see them throw everything they have at it because they understand that this might be, again, a kind of life or death issue for their profitability, for their success.
Yeah, that's exactly what's happening here. And we don't think that the stakeholders understand the magnitude of this. You used the analogy of a full court press, which I love because it's a sport analogy and I'm a basketball guy. But when I see this lobbying activity and the firms that the NCAA and Power 5 have hired and the tactics that they have used in the congressional hearing so far, I view it as just a scorched earth. We're going to get this doggone thing done come hell or high water. And we don't care what the rest of the stakeholders think. We're invested in this. We want this protective federal legislation. We're playing this game inside the Beltway. And we need this to protect our business interests and our economic interests, which, I think a lot of people might find ironic because all these institutions, the Power 5 conferences, the NCAA, they operate as education nonprofits, right?
There's the rub, that these are nonprofits, but are such money-making ventures. And so that, I think, again, feeds the controversy around this is, should they really be investing so much of the money that they are raising in tuition and tuition hikes and really focusing so much of their firepower at this one issue, as opposed to kind of what they exist to do? So it's not surprising that this is a controversial issue.
Well, it's not controversial because nobody's talking about it.
Well, right. Rather the sports versus education purpose.
Right. And you mentioned, the tuition dollars. I think that a lot of people think that the expenses that the NCAA, for example, has with its the litigation, campaign, their lobbying campaign, that is shared among schools. That revenue comes from only one source, and that's the March Madness contract. The NCAA's sole source of revenue is from that. And to make this even worse, the group of laborers, athletes who provide the labor for that revenue are overwhelmingly African American. And so you have this kind of regressive transfer of wealth, and the NCAA is taking that money and they're hiring Brownstein Hyatt. And that goes to the access issue, I think. And, you talked about the connections, and I don't think a lot of the athletes or their parents are going to be playing golf or tennis with, a bunch of rich people in DC. And I think that kind of goes to the core of what your organization is doing. So do you see those disparities? I mean, is that when we look at the
Absolutely.
access issues, we have to look at that, don't we?
We do. And it's unfortunate that it's so obscure, but it's easy to tabulate the money spent. So we at least have that resource. That's not all of the money. There is money surely being spent, again, maybe in ways that are not technically lobbying, but this is just the at least figure. But then on top of that, there is, again, the revolving door and the value that has. Now, that is in some ways shown by the amount that they're spending. You can't hire somebody, a former member of Congress or a former chief of staff or a former issue expert on Capitol Hill without paying a little more. And that's why, that's why people do their stint on Capitol Hill in Congress and then transfer that into big bucks on K Street. But again, this is an elite circle of influence, and it's kind of centered on the money, but that's not all of it, and we don't necessarily see how influence works when it's, again, a member of Congress playing golf with a coach, some
or a conference
influential
commissioner. Yeah,
exactly.
So I wanted to just take a minute to go through a couple of specific lobbying disclosure reports, and I also want to ask you. So we have the lobbying firms, we have these big firms. Is it important can you go down to a more granular level and look at the individual lobbyists? Are there certain individual lobbyists or teams of lobbyists that kind of develop an expertise and kind of work with different clients through that collective experience and expertise?
Well, with regard to athletes' rights, this issue, there are specific lobbyists that stand out as being kind of influential and used by a number of the clients. Well, Marshall and Pop is a firm that pops up routinely among these clients. Hazen Marshall and Monica Pop started the firm after working for Republican Senators Mitch McConnell and John Cornyn, respectively. So that is a pretty critical link between all of the clients. And if these are people who have access still to Senators McConnell and Cornyn, their staff, potentially committee staff, that's what you're paying for in part. Subject Matter is another firm formerly known as Elmendorf Bryan, I believe. They employ Stacey Alexander. She was chief of staff to Representative Jim Matheson, Democrat of Utah, and Natalie Farr, chief of staff to Senator Cory Gardner of Colorado, Republican of Colorado, Cedric Grant, chief of staff to Representative Hakeem Jeffries, a Democrat of New York, for a number of years. And former members, Kenny Hulshoff works at Cassidy for the Big 12, and Sachs P. Chambliss works at DLA Piper for the ACC. So yes, they have good representation by people who have very current and presumably quite influential relationships with decision makers.
And what's interesting about that, you identified Elmendorf Ryan, Subject Matter, and then also Marshall and Pop. Those two firms work for all 5 Power 5 conferences, so that it goes to the coordination issue. And none of those, the only firm that the NCAA has is Brownstein Hyatt, and Brownstein Hyatt does not represent the Power 5, so there's kind of some separation there. But I have two lobbying disclosure documents, both Brownstein Hyatt clients, one for the NCAA, the other for Purdue Pharma. And looking at the individual lobbyists, Purdue has 6 lobbyists listed on their lobbying disclosure form. And they say that their lobbying activity is monitoring legislative and regulatory activities impacting the pharmaceutical industry. Pretty broad. And then you go to and I guess I should also note that this is from the second quarter of 2022. And Purdue Pharma paid Brownstein Hyatt $50,000 for that quarter. These reports are quarterly, and they have to identify how much they pay. The NCAA, their lobbying report, this is from the fourth quarter of 2022, and they paid Brownstein Hyatt $90,000, almost twice as much as Purdue Pharma paid them. And here's how they describe their activity. They say issues related to athletic scholarships, health and safety, gender equity, academic success, the collegiate model, amateurism, and higher education. That's pretty broad. That covers a lot of territory. And then they list 4 bills that I think most people reading that would probably believe, because the NCAA is an education nonprofit, that all those bills are bills that would protect athletes and be beneficial to athletes, when in fact some of those bills have what I call the 3 death provisions, which would essentially eliminate, end the athletes' rights movement. But there are 13 lobbyists. What is it? 12, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12 lobbyists for Brownstein Hyatt that are working for the NCAA. When you compare those 2 lists, 5 of the 6 lobbyists that work for Purdue Pharma also work for the NCAA. And does that crossover tell a story to you in terms of the expertise and the tactics and the way that these particular lobbyists think about their role as a lobbyist with these big business interests?
What this means is they are hiring expert lobbyists who know how to get doors open, calls returned, know what to say, what not to say, to make it easy for the members of Congress to do what they're hoping they'll do. So again, they view their job as providing, everything and the pen for them to sign. And it's not surprising that they would be filling out the disclosure reports in ways that might obfuscate their true purpose. Lobbying firms love the disclosure that we provide for free on open secrets. They use it for headhunting and competitive analysis. They hate it about themselves, of course, because they don't want to give up their secrets. Excuse me. So they want to provide information that at a minimum appears to comply with the requirements of the reports, but doesn't necessarily reveal their strategy.
But when you look at these 2 lists and the crossover, Purdue Pharma, one of the frankly, one of the most corrupt companies, notorious industries in America. And you have those same lobbyists lobbying for the NCAA, who's built its image around values and protecting and advancing the interests of student athletes. Do you see any irony there? And do you think that that's essentially a declaration of interest, that the NCAA is coming in and they're going to do whatever they have to do to get their way in Congress?
Well, I'm not in a position to weigh in on the character of the lobbyists. And of course, like lawyers, they would say everyone deserves a representation.
Let me just say, I wasn't talking about the individual lobbyists. They're doing their job. I'm an attorney and I was in private practice with a large firm. I represented large corporate interests. So I did not mean to suggest, I'm talking about if you're the NCAA and you're looking for a lobbyist in a lobbying firm, and you're finding a firm that is really doing some challenging work with companies that have a less than ideal history, is that a declaration of your interests? And looking at it through the lens of the NCAA, not the individual lobbyists.
Yeah, they're working with people who are good at crisis management,
right?
Presumably. And but again, I think in every case, the client that's paying a lot of money is conveying when it's all on the line. There are firms, there are big multinational corporations that have firms on retainer, and you'll see the same amount quarter after quarter. And it's insurance. They have representation. They might have in-house and hired guns at their disposal, and they're working issues, but it's not existential. Whereas in this case, you might see the money really skyrocket and more hands on deck, more hired guns working the issue, because this is really seen as an existential threat to their business. And we've seen that again, in other instances where suddenly Congress or the White House pivots to really focus on one target, and that targeted industry or company, they view it as this is it. We have to, I really apologize. I keep thinking of these idioms like we have to leave it all on the field, that you have to do everything that you possibly can to avert this crisis. And if that means shifting more of your resources into hiring more hands or more connected people or experts in this field, you will, and they do. And again, this is not all that they're spending. They're likely, many times they're also pairing that with a public facing campaign. So there are now posters in bus stops on Capitol Hill so that members and their staffs see them as they're going down to the metro or to the bus. But then, all across the country in the right places, they might be trying to shift the dialogue around an issue. What better success could they have than if it's like, don't trust me. Everybody knows that this is what you should be doing.
Right. That you just perfectly described what the NCAA has been doing. When you use the term existential threat, that's precisely the phrase that they use. And they say that, with this new name, image, and likeness market, or any change in the business model that would result in athletes being paid or being recognized as employees, they're saying that's an existential threat to this thing we love so much, this sacred college sports product. And in terms of their public facing campaign, they've been doing that for 70 years. But, in 2014, when they hired Brownstein Hyatt, they hired Bully Pulpit Interactive Inc., it really ramped up. It's very sophisticated and it's pervasive. And one of those tactics that you alluded to is everybody agrees. Who could disagree? And that's a very powerful advantage if you can have people already kind of bought into your value system, and then you say, well, any change to it's going to bring it to its knees. And it sounds to me like, from what you're saying, that's kind of a common tactic for the bigs in their.
It's a common tactic for lobbyists of all. I mean, even the small firms are looking at what works and parroting and mimicking those tactics. So this is, I think, also part of kind of lobbying 101. You want to have the cordial relations in place so that when you need them on behalf of your client, all you have to do is pick up the phone. But you also, at the same time, on a major campaign, will not stop at lobbying. That's just the first step. But then you have these other assets at your disposal that you can use. And, maybe it also means you're reaching out to athletes in Congress, people like Senators Booker, Manchin, Tuberville, Coach Tuberville. There might be all kinds of relationships existing, conversations that are taking place that we'll have no way of necessarily knowing about.
Right. And that goes to the transparency issue. And it's my belief that the athletes should have access to all the communications between the lobbyists and the stakeholders, the political stakeholders, because this legislation could forever change the relationship between the athletes and the institutions and the NCAA, and they really don't have a seat at the table. And that goes to one of the issues that, a couple of weeks ago, when we first talked, we talked about this kind of the outward expression of benevolent intentions that disguise perhaps some fine print that's inconsistent with those benevolent intentions. And I think that's particularly a powerful tool for nonprofits that have a benevolent face. Could you talk a little bit about that as a tactic and how effective you think it might be in congressional campaigns?
Every politician wants to be able to convincingly persuade their voting constituency that they are really above money's influence, above undue influence by forces that we know are at work in politics, in a privately funded democracy. That's the system. Right. So it's absolutely advantageous to them if the lobbyists working on behalf of clients are helping them to present their position on decisions as being benevolent, as being in the public, in the interest of the public, or supporting the public welfare, as opposed to being something perhaps they personally either benefit from if they have investments in something or care about, and also their contributors care about it. So that is another asset that the lobbyists have at their disposal, that they may contribute to members of Congress. Again, that's kind of another way to grease the skids to ensure that their calls are returned and they have those meetings held, again, on behalf of whichever client, if they are a lobbyist, but if they're in-house, that too can be useful to them because they might be making a contribution, or the people that they represent might be making contributions, and they're supposed to disclose bundles, but that, is effectively kind of on the honor system. We don't necessarily know how they're engineering money to members of Congress, but clearly it is of major benefit to the lobbyist if they can convince the legislator that they're lobbying that this is common sense and American. These are patriotic
right.
values. What's more patriotic than American? Teamwork and leadership and sports are at the center of that. And it's such, it makes us all so proud. So that is certainly, it's logical to think that that's at work here. And again, they're connected to these institutions of higher learning. So there is even that loftier connection.
Yeah, and that's why I think so many people, even people at the institutional level, may be surprised at the profile of the lobbying effort for the NCAA and the Power Five. And to that point, when you look at the might that those interests are bringing to the table here, what message would you have for athletes who may not know what lobbying is, to at least have their voices represented in the discussion? I mean, is it just too big of a task when you look at the power that the NCAA and the Power Five are bringing to this battle?
I think they will be very well served if they understand who the players are, what they want, and what they're, sorry, when I say players, I don't mean the sports athletes. Yeah. I mean the players in this debate, who the players in the debate are, what they want, what their end goal is, and what they're doing to get it. And part of that is understanding what they're spending, what they're paying to get it. So that's why, again, we feel that this transparency that Open Secrets tries to provide is not just disclosure, it's not just data, but it's access to more complete, more intelligible, easy to absorb, accurate information. So this is not partisan, this is independent. We are an independent organization. We aim, the coin of our realm is trust and reliability. So we need people to see that the data is verifiable, it is accurate, it is as timely and comprehensive as we can make it. And it is trustworthy, so that people across the ideological spectrum and on both sides of any argument can point to it and say, this is factual, this is what's happening. It's crucial to self-governance. At the highest level, democracy doesn't work if we don't have access to the information. And that's what Open Secrets aims to provide, is that true transparency. The players obviously have a lot on their plate, and we don't expect them to become interested necessarily, much less experts in money and politics. They just need to know that this information is there, it's reliable, it's, I think, helpful for them to understand it, even if they ultimately decide a different way, whatever they decide in terms of their own views and their own activism, understand who's at the table, because what happens at the table, what decisions get made in Congress and in state capitals, it will affect you. It does affect you every day of the week. It affects your wallet, it affects your health, it affects your bottom line, it affects your families, and it affects you for the future, for years to come. So we hope to educate the public to be a little bit more savvy and not cynical. This is democracy. But you can do it. You can get it more engaged. You can get smarter. You can get the information you need on a particular issue in order to be more effective at representing your own interests.
Right. Well, this has been fantastic. I have one substantive question and then kind of a closeout question that you just talked about a little bit. But a lot of people think that the NCAA and Power Five are not going to get this protective federal legislation, in large part because it was running, originally ran through a partisan lens, and the Republican bills were more NCAA friendly, and the NCAA was hoping that the midterm elections were going to turn out differently. And if there was a Republican controlled Senate, then they might get what they want. But so a lot of people are saying that the NCAA and Power Five are kind of not going to get anything productive from Congress. And I have had a different view of that. And I want to talk a little bit about the tactics of the bigs and their persistence. And they're playing the long game. And when you look at the profile of the firms that the NCAA and Power Five have engaged with, and the fact that this campaign began in 2019, do you see them just throwing up their arms and saying, "Oh, we're just going to walk away from Congress"? Or do you think they're going to be in it, and they're in it big, and they're going to be in it the way that any other big would be?
Yeah. Never say never. Never say die. There's interests that spend this kind of money, that are this engaged, that are working and used to working their channels of influence on behalf of their issues and their clients and their entity, their institutions. No, this is what they do. They're not going to throw up their hands. And there's always another opportunity. There's always another bite at the apple. There's always a new Congress. There's always a new administration. There are changes to the rules that change everything. And suddenly you need to get back to work to take advantage or to stop the bleeding. So this is unless and until we have a different form of government, in our democracy, in American democracy, there has always been the influence of money, an elite influence of all kinds. And they are going to, these entities, again, it is existential for some of them, depending on what government does, but it's also proven to be very lucrative, very successful for them to know exactly how to work government to their advantage, to check all the boxes and do everything right, so that when the moment of truth comes, they have the ability to call in their chits, to get their friends in Congress, in positions of power to help. And it's not just Congress, it's again the agencies. Once Congress passes a bill, if they pass a bill, then it moves to implementation. And that's another opportunity for the interest to say, well, we lost that fight, but now we get to water down the bill. Now our aim is not to kill the bill, it's to water it down, to make sure that the regulations and the implementation of those regulations are as weak or as favorable to us as possible.
So I want to close out with the cynicism optimism coin. And I have been pulled to the cynicism side. And what we're doing with the DYK is giving me some energy to feel more optimistic. But you've expressed some optimism and some hope. And could you explain where that comes from and how you see your work, your organization's work, and striking an optimistic note going forward?
I think I love democracy. I'm energized because I think we don't have it perfect, but we got the basics right. When you look around the world, when you talk to people, even with the challenges, the extreme challenges that our democracy has faced over the last few years, the divisiveness, the hyper polarization and vitriol, even still, there are so many other places that I would not want to live. And it's because they don't have the freedoms and the access to information that we have here. We have the power in our hands if only we recognize it and use it. And I get it. We're all busy. We're all struggling. We're all trying to put food on the table and make ends meet. And that gets harder as our society becomes less and less equal. And so that's, a related challenge. But we have power here that we are so, so fortunate to have because of, the brilliant people who came before us, who put these tools, these opportunities in place for us. So my pitch is everything you do today is crucial to where we're headed tomorrow. And what we are doing to make a more perfect union is absolutely a down payment on that future. And from my view, ultimately, the whole human project, right? We are here not just to make it better for me, my family, my community, ourselves, America, but also to kind of spread the gospel of democracy, that it is in its best form, really powerful and ultimately freeing for everyone.
Yeah, that's a beautiful message, Sheila. Thank you.
Hope
And
that's
thank
helpful.
yeah, well, I think it's helpful. People need to hear that, because I think
Yeah,
a lot of
there's hope.
people get pulled the direction that I have been pulled. And I want to believe that, the little guy has a shot, and has equal access to democracy. But what we've been talking about, you see some big challenges, particularly for marginalized communities. And a lot of athletes come from marginalized communities. But I do have hope.
I will say this is kind of going in the wrong direction, but I also feel like, what choice do we have?
Well, that's
What
important
choice do
too.
we have?
What choice do we have? Right.
What are we going to do? Give up and say, oh, well,
Yeah.
no, there's always hope. There's always an opportunity. We need to see the opportunities and take them.
Well, I love what Open Secrets is doing. I do rely on your work, and I probably should be donating. And maybe when I'm on the website next, I'll do that. It's a great resource, and it's an important resource. Thank you for all of your great work. And thank you for joining us today. This is a really important conversation.
My pleasure. So happy to be here, and I look forward to following this issue and hope our resources continue to be of service.
Perfect. We'll stay in touch. Thanks, Sheila.
Thank you.